Ifad is a really fascinating tradition. It's a divinatory system, and so a method of receiving privileged information from a Yoruba Orisha or deity. In Yoruba mythology, Orunmila existed at the beginning or the foundation of the universe, and so sees everything unfolding in essence outside of time and has privileged knowledge of the total cosmic order of everything that exists. It involves an incredibly vast amount of knowledge in the form of memorized poems, proverbs, songs, myths that the diviners memorize. And they use a process very similar to European, Middle Eastern, and Islamic forms of geomancy. To test whether the diviner is legitimate or not, you don't even need to tell them the problem you have or the question you have.
So picture this. It's a quiet evening, open skies, it's an ancient village, and the air is humming with anticipation. There's a group of people peering at a patch of earth, and there is one head which is poring over the cracks in the earth. They use a stick to draw some lines, which to all of us who are untrained just look like lines. But to someone who's trained, they reveal unseen energies and the way we humans are aligning with the earth. So we're going to talk about geomancy today. And the term originates from a Greek word. Geo means earth, and mantia means divination or prophecy. And you would have heard of geomancy in some form or the other. It's prevalent in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, and it's called different names. Some people, like in Europe, it's called geomancy, but in India, it's called Vastu. In Africa, it's called Ifa. In China, it's called Feng Shui. So there's many, many different names to this science or art, call it whatever, that helps you align with the natural world. It helps you align your energy with the energy of the natural world. Welcome to Wellness Curated. This is your host, Anshu Bahanda, and as we talk about mystical practices for modern minds, today we're going to talk about geomancy and its role in understanding our relationship with the natural world. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ayodeji Ogunnaike, who's a scholar who specializes in African and Afro-diasporic religion. And he focuses on religions in Nigeria and its connection with Brazil. Dr. Ogunnaike is a PhD from Harvard. His research on Ifa specializes on divination systems from Yoruba land in West Africa, which I'm very excited about because I've done, work. I worked in the art business in Africa, so this is a real treat for me. He also talks a lot, and his research focuses on candomblé, which is an Afro-Brazilian religious tradition. And he also talks about the impact of modernity on indigenous African religion. Welcome to the chat, Dr. Ogunnaike.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Now tell me, can we start with, will you explain to me what is geomancy?
Yeah, geomancy, there are kind of broader and then perhaps even more narrow ways that you could define it or understand it. I think you did a very good job of introducing it at the beginning or the intro of this episode, that technically speaking, it's the interpretation of specifically the earth or a number of natural elements, being able to read or the signs that exist in them or manipulating them. Scholars oftentimes talk about a random generator, so a process that produces some kind of information from natural material that you can then interpret. The traditional way that it's usually done is by as you mentioned, making dots or drawing lines on the earth or the sand. But then there are other kind of ritualized ways that it has developed. People have done it by making the same signs, dots, and lines on paper. They'll use sometimes crushed wood material, so like wood powder or things like that. So it doesn't have to just be the earth. It could be sand, it could be any number of different materials. And as it's developed, people have come up with increasingly kind of sophisticated or complicated methods of achieving more or less the same ends.
So, where I've seen it, I've also seen people work with ley lines a lot.
Mhm.
And I've seen people walk around with something that detects radiation, like a little device that moves around based on radiation.
Mm.
Um, so can you explain all that? Just the general term of geomancy and all the different things that are could be involved.
Yeah, so it could involve any number of different kind of natural materials. I'm not as familiar with some of those methods that you've talked about, because my expertise is primarily in Africa and the African
Mhm.
diaspora. But the kind of underlying cosmological system that undergirds geomancy and the process, how it operates, is an understanding of a fundamental order, a kind of divine or cosmic order of all of life, right? And how everything is interconnected, and so you can learn to identify the patterns in the natural world if you interact with it appropriately that give you, in essence, a kind of window into this kind of cosmic order that usually is imperceptible to human beings in our kind of everyday lives. So the type of rituals that you're describing, I think, would very much fit that kind of description, that you
Mhm.
have materials from the natural world that interact with each other or can reveal certain kinds of information if you have been trained to be able to observe them and interpret them.
Explain IFA to us, because I don't think that many people all over the world know of it. So I'm very excited to have you explain it to us.
Sure. So Ifad is a really fascinating tradition. It's a divinatory system, and so a method of receiving privileged information from a Yoruba Orisha or deity, a religious figure called Orunmila. In Yoruba mythology, existed at
Wow, it's
the
called
beginning.
Urmila.
Orunmila is the deity, but
Wow,
Orunmila
okay, because
also
it sounds
sometimes.
Indian almost.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So Aruba is sometimes also called Ifa, and there are some people when they talk about the connections between Ifa and Islamic forms of geomancy, draw parallels between the word or the name Orumila and the
Mhm.
Arabic word Ramal. And so in Arabic, ilm Ramal or darba Ramal is how you would refer to what we know as geomancy. That's the term
Okay,
for an
okay.
Arabic process. Um, so in Yoruba mythology, Orunmila existed at the beginning of the foundation of the universe, and so sees everything unfolding in essence outside of time and has privileged knowledge of, the total cosmic order of everything that exists. And through this system of divination, you're able to receive a message about what you need to know for a particular moment in time in your particular situation. It involves an incredibly vast amount of knowledge in the form of memorized poems, proverbs, songs, myths that the diviners memorize. And they use a process very similar to European, Middle Eastern, and Islamic forms of geomancy. You interpret these
That
symbols.
was Urmila.
Yeah, freaking about the situation. You interpret those symbols and draw on this vast body of memorized information and knowledge to set people's lives in proper order. It also includes a vast array of pharmacology, right? So information about the secret nature of the natural world and how we can leverage that to help people live better lives.
How is this? So people would have come across, say, if those who have come across the European form of geomancy, how are they different?
So if anyone is familiar with the European form or system of geomancy, there are those 16 figures, right? That's a combination of one or two dots in four rows. And you'll find the exact same symbols used in Ifa The exact same ones. They have different names. They have indigenous Yoruba names, but the symbols are exactly the same. The way that they're derived is a little bit different. In Ifa, you would use either 16 palm kernels that a diviner will hold in their hands and cup up like this, and then depending on how many they catch and see remaining in their other hand, they'll make a line or a dot, one or two, and then they'll derive the symbols that way. Or they use a divining chain, which is made from elements of the palm tree. And depending on how half shells fall either concave or convex, that will help them derive the symbol that way. So the symbols are very much the same, and it involves a similar interpretive practice of the configuration of natural material, vast corpus of indigenous knowledge, all in Yoruba that's memorized by the diviners, is quite different. There is a similar interpretive practice of linking a kind of narrative structure to these signs that have been derived from the geomancy process. But the material that exists in it is very different. It's completely indigenous for the Yoruba. And my theory, along with some other scholars, is that because the indigenous Yoruba cosmology operates in a way that's very similar to that of European and Islamic geomancy, it was very easy to integrate the symbolism and certain aspects of the way geomancy is carried out in other contexts, and then merge them together in what we now know as Ifa today.
And is Ifa practiced widely today?
Yes, very, very widely. It depends on how you would define people practicing Ifa. I frequently speak with a Babalawo in practically every continent. The Babalawo is the term for the Yoruba term for an Ifa diviner. They are in practically every country in the world. Some scholars estimate that there are at least tens of millions of people all around the world who come to perform divination for them. Some of the diviners I work with in Nigeria, while I've worked with them, we have attended to clients in the UK, in Germany. I've had people contact me about finding babalawos they can work with from all over the world.
Tell me, is this the same as the Islamic tradition? Is Ifa the same as the Islamic tradition?
Some scholars have hypothesized that they are the same, and there are a number of very good reasons for that. I happen to think that they are different. There are a number of indigenous African systems of divination or geomancy that I think are primarily derived from Islamic geomancy. And most of them have preserved some of the Arabic names of either the symbols or the houses, is what they call them. You derive further symbols from the initial ones that you get from the lines in the sand, and their positions, right? Which number they are in the series of derivation is oftentimes called a house. And those houses frequently contain either an Arabic name or have an Arabic name or an indigenized version of it. So you translate it from Arabic into an African language. And that's a good clue that it is primarily an Islamic system of divination that's just been indigenized. The Yoruba system does not have this kind of recursive process of deriving the symbols from the initial ones. You just get one right away. And then all of the material that is contained within that symbol is completely indigenous. It all uses Yoruba names and terms and categories, and it refers to things that don't have much of an antecedent in Islamic traditions. So I view them as different, but very much linked. I've worked with Muslim diviners and Ifa diviners, and they oftentimes say that even though their systems differ slightly, they'll give you the same sign at the end of the day, and their messages may differ a little bit because one's articulated in an Islamic cosmology, and the other is from a traditional Yoruba cosmology, but the messages are almost the same.
Is this something that's done with the earth, or do you also do it in buildings, in houses, and in offices?
Yeah, I would say it's primarily done in buildings, which is why, it depends on how you interpret the term geomancy. If you interpret it very literally, it's something that you would do on or with the earth. And that does, in many cases, it can still happen. If for most Muslim diviners that I know in Nigeria who practice geomancy, they'll have a board and they'll have sand that they kind of cast on it, and then they draw the lines there, and they'll derive the geomantic symbols from the sand on that board. The
I
Ifa
see.
system is very similar. They have what's called an Okban Ifa, and you may have actually seen some of them in your work in African art. It's one of the most iconic pieces of African art. They're usually round, but sometimes kind of rectangular shaped, and they have a bit of a kind of a hole in the middle where they put camwood powder or a particular kind of wood powder, and they
Okay.
press the symbols onto that wood powder there. And so they can, in essence, do it anywhere. They aren't limited to just doing it outside. They can do it
Outside.
in a building, anywhere.
It's fascinating because it's reminds me, I've worked very closely with both feng shui and vastu,
Mhm.
particularly. And now even those are done primarily in buildings, though when people are buying a piece of land, they might take a specialist to
Mhm.
tell them about that piece of land, even before they built buildings there. And sometimes it's fascinating because sometimes people start saying to them, are you some sort of a soothsayer? How do you know so much about me? Because just
Mhm.
by going into someone's house, you can say, like what part of the house people have illnesses, or where
Mhm.
in someone's body would, I remember someone came into my house and said to me, oh, has your foot been hurting the last
Mhm.
2 years? And I was freaked out. I'm like, how do you know?
Have you-
But I guess, that's something that you can tell because of the alignment with the earth.
Yeah, with the systems of geomancy that I'm most familiar with, some of the very advanced practitioners can actually do that. They'll look at people and they'll be able to just identify the patterns in the world. The system itself is primarily one you could describe as a bit like reading the cosmos. And so they don't necessarily have privileged information just by seeing the world. They get a message and they interpret it. And
Mhm,
sometimes, as you said, it can be very, very specific. I have
mhm,
stories and stories about
mhm.
very particular messages that you think could
Tell
never
me one,
actually.
tell me an interesting story, just,
Um,
so people understand what we're talking about.
Sure, I'll try to think of a good one. So there was one time there was a woman who came to the diviner that I worked with most closely in Nigeria. I served as a kind of apprentice for him for a year, and he was the one who taught me how the system of Ifa divination works. There was a man who came to visit him, and the way the IFA system works to test whether the diviner is legitimate or not, you don't even need to tell them the problem you have or the question you have. If they're really good at what they do, they should be able to just tell you what it is. So he came, the diviner performed IFA divination and said, "Oh, you're here because you want to marry a woman. Um, you're unsure about whether or not it's a good idea. If she has a birthmark on the inside of her right thigh, that is the person that you are meant to marry, and you shouldn't waste too much time before proposing to her." And the man got shocked, and looked at the Araba, that's the title of the diviner with whom I worked. He said, "Yes, that's exactly why I'm here. I've been in a relationship with my girlfriend for a while, and she does have a birthmark on that part of her body. So you're saying everything is okay? This is the decision I should make?" He said, "Well, uh, I'm not telling you that. That's what
Mhm.
Ifa is.
That's what's
This is
coming
kind
to
of
me. Yeah.
right. This is the way cosmically your destiny and her destiny have been constructed. And so if what you say is true and she has the birthmark, go ahead and get married."
If I take all that information and relate it to where we are today,
Mhm.
on the planet, where stress and anxiety is so high, tell
Mhm.
me, how can we use something like IFA, geomancy, to help people bring peace to their lives and for them to get grounded and get stability and calmness?
It's a really wonderful question. I think the best place to start, and I experience this with my students all the time, is our world is seemingly increasingly chaotic. There are problems everywhere. The world isn't really well ordered, and that causes anxiety, especially when we recognize that we human beings are the primary reason for that. And so we need to do something to get it back in order. And I think that anxiety is, in and of itself, not actually a bad thing. The anxiety will drive us to take some kind of action. The question, of
Mhm.
course, is what kind of action do we take? And that's where geomancy or systems like IFA can be incredibly valuable. One, because they give us direct advice about practical advice about what we can and should do. But if we stop and think about that process itself, If a system of geomancy, for example, can tell you what you should do practically, it means that there is a kind of cosmic order behind all of the apparent chaos that we see. Um, and that we are, in fact, actually a very small part of it, likely not even the most powerful or authoritative part of it. And so all we really need to do is identify what our kind of roles are in the cosmic play. And if we play our part well, we at least will be at harmony with ourselves and with everything around us, regardless of what's happening with the outside world. And we can kind of give up control of everything else that's happening. Because the fact of the matter is, our abilities are very, very limited. Our cosmic perspective is very, very limited as well. And so if we try to take on too much, it will always just crush us because we're not capable of bearing that much. And so I think both the practical advice of a system like Ifa or geomancy is very, very helpful and can direct our anxiety. But if we reflect on it and what it means and how it operates, I think it can also give us a great amount of peace as well in knowing how we fit into the cosmos and what we do need to worry about and what we don't really need to worry about or what we can't really change and what's beyond our power.
You're talking, and rightly so, about how there is a cosmic order. And if we align with that order and work with the energies of that order, we have less resistance in our lives. And, if we almost surrender to that order. What about free will then?
Yeah, the Yoruba have a really wonderful way of approaching this. I did a lecture in a class on it just yesterday. We have a concept of ori, which literally in Yoruba means your head. You have an inner head and an outer head. Your outer head is this physical one that you can see and interact with. Your inner head is really like your cosmic double or your cosmic identity and self outside of space and time. And every person's responsibility is to understand the contents or the nature of your head or your destiny, to cultivate a positive relationship with it and to work with it and manifest it as directly and appropriately as possible. Now, where free will comes into it is the Yoruba say you actually choose your head outside of space and time in heaven. And you don't always know exactly what the contents are, but you make the conscious choice. And also, it is your choice whether or not you choose to cultivate a positive and productive relationship with your head. So I told students, I'm a fairly short person. If I decided I wanted to be a professional basketball player, I likely wouldn't get terribly far, right? That's not part of my ori or my destiny. I have the free will to try to force it to happen, but it's not going to result in anything positive for me.
So you're saying we have a little bit of free will, as long as it's within the cosmic order, as long as we stick to the cosmic order. That's not our free will. The cosmic order is the order of the universe, so to say.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's the perspective of the geomantic traditions that I know. They're these broad cosmic forces that were going to do what they do one way or the other. Geomancy from the Middle East, Europe, and the Islamic context are also very closely tied with astrology. The movement of the stars in the heavens is more or less independent of what I want as an individual person. I can't change it, but I could understand how it might affect my life, and then I can choose to respond in relation to that. Therapists often talk about this same kind of process. They say oftentimes you can only clean up your side of the street. In a relationship with other people, you can't change another person. And it's probably not good to invest too much in changing another person. What we can do is change the way that we respond to them or we relate to them. That is within our power and control. And if it's true of just another human being, if we think about the whole cosmos, my goodness, how it seems a bit arrogant to assume that we could exert huge influence over something as broad and as vast as that.
And also going back to something you said to me earlier, you were saying that we can really practice geomancy anywhere. And we were talking particularly about the Ifa tradition where you talked about the board and the sand, which can be done anywhere. Are there situations where the geomancy doesn't work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do know with respect to the Islamic forms of geomancy with which I'm familiar, there are times when you are not supposed to do it. I believe in some traditions at least, sunrise, sunset, and high noon are times when you are not supposed to perform geomancy. I'm not an expert on the actual practice of it myself. So it may have something to do with the fact that you're supposed to be praying at those moments, as opposed to performing geomancy. But it could also just be that because of those important cardinal points of the sun, that it's not an auspicious time to be engaging in that practice. With respect to Ifa, I don't know of particular times or places when it's not supposed to work, but the people who perform divination or geomancy, and also the tools or implements that they use, do need to be prepared appropriately. Right? There are rituals of purification that you have to go through. The Yoruba would say to allow them to speak, right? Otherwise, you could still, cast a divining chain or, use palm kernels or, whatever other method you use to gain the information. But it might just be random nonsense, and
Right.
interpreting it won't get you anywhere. So that's why there are ritual practices that you have to learn and you have to master and you have to be careful about observing. So I'm not sure about specific places where it cannot work, as much as conditions in which you're maybe not supposed to do it. And then
Okay.
also some which you are. Sometimes the physical orientation of the board that you're using or the way the diviner is sitting matters quite a lot.
What about negative energies? How do you deal with situations how do you stop negative energies from coming into play?
That's primarily the goal or the purpose of these rituals of purification. There are certain states of being in which you're not supposed to perform those rituals, the ritual of divination or geomancy, because it could leave you open to something like that, for example. Or it would still allow you to receive the message, but there's a very human element in geomancy. Right? It can be very scientific and precise, but even with the most precise science, there's always a human element of interpretation and application. And so if you are not prepared to interpret correctly or accurately yourself, that can actually be very dangerous.
And what about when it suggests disharmony or imbalance in the environment? Then how would a geomantic diviner rebalance the environment for the client?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think they would likely take it on a case by case basis. But the broad answer that I think I could give is that it always involves some form of sacrifice or ritual action. A person has to give something up, usually, to set everything right.
You're just saying it
Yeah,
involves some form of sacrifice, whether material or non-material, normally.
right.
I was just saying, what are some of the common misconceptions that you've seen about geomancy
Yeah, there are. I think one of the biggest is that because there is a strong element, especially in Africa, of secrecy to geomancy, um, people perceive it as perhaps a bit sinister. They're not well educated about it, and they're worried that the people who do it, because there's an understanding that it's very powerful, if it's powerful in secret, that there might be something sinister there, and that it might be evil, and it might be
Right.
predatory.
So I also want to ask you about candomblé, the religious tradition that developed, the African Brazilian religious tradition that's developed. Where does geomancy play a role in that?
So yeah, Ifa was one of the predominant Yoruba religious traditions, and along with many others, it was brought to Brazil and was practiced there for a while because of how complex the system is and the amount of knowledge that's necessary to practice it well and the amount of time it takes to train. It's very, very intensive. Because of the very difficult conditions for Africans and their descendants in Brazil in the 19th century primarily, the tradition didn't survive. So it was an important part of Afro-Brazilian religion in the areas where it was present. But somewhere in the early 20th century, it fell out of use because people were not trained to continue it. That has changed, however, now in starting in, I want to say, maybe the 1970s and certainly by the 1980s. With increased connection with Nigeria, more and more people have been initiated into Ifa, and it's becoming an increasingly large part of the practice of candomblé.
Now we're surrounded by electromagnetic waves, Wi-Fi, phones, computers. We're constantly in this space. So does geomancy have a solution to all these waves of creating harmony in spite of the way we live?
I think this is just my own personal opinion that if we were to, perform Ifa divination or geomancy for modern society as a whole, I think it would say that our relationship with technology is out of balance. We're addicted to it, and it distracts us from things that we're really supposed to focus on. And so we need to get connected to other things. We need to stop living so much in a world that we've created in machines, and then understand how to relate to a broader world that existed, has existed for all of our existence and has quite a lot to teach us. That's where the wisdom of these traditions actually comes from, right? Interpreting signs in the world and the cosmology
Mhm.
around us. And we've become very disconnected from that, I think, in the modern world.
So, what does IFA say about AI
Oh, um,
in
you,
general?
I'm not a practicing diviner myself, so I'd probably have to ask one of them. But I did write an article once on how the tradition of Ifa, there's a particular verse that I was taught by the diviner who trained me. Um, that described, in essence, our kind of modern world or the society that was brought by Europeans to Nigeria as a disordered way of interacting with Ogun. And Ogun, back from the first part of my last name, is the Yoruba deity of iron, technology, progress. He's very kind
Oh,
of individualistic and hyper-productive. And I go into an analysis of how Ogun is not a bad deity. Just like everything, it's about balance, right? You need to learn how to interact with Ogun properly. And there's a Yoruba system of how you do that. You understand what the potential dangers are if you don't do it well, and you understand what the benefits are if you do it well. And I, prompted by this verse from the Ifa oral corpus that I was taught, I reflected on just that one verse and myths that I know about Ogun that seem to very much fit modern American society and capitalism and technology. AI would be a great example of that, and how we focus too much on it and we've integrated it too much into our lives at the expense or without being balanced by a number of other factors. So I think it wouldn't say it's bad. Our reliance on it is perhaps disordered, and we need to be very
right.
careful and make sure we understand it and how we should interact with it before we integrate it into every aspect of how we live.
Also, coming back to uh, how geomancy has been adapted in modern times. So, IFA, particularly because that's your specialization, have you seen it help businesses and organizations or individuals on an everyday level?
Absolutely. Yeah, I know of, never mention names, but I know of a very prominent businessman in Nigeria who became very widely celebrated and successful, who made his business decisions based on advice that he received from Ifa, from the diviner that I worked with and know. Um, the challenge, I think, especially in a modern context, is that we're oriented very differently from the cosmology of geomantic systems or a system like Ifa. When you come to Ifa, or we call it Inyarin in Yoruba, the Muslim form of geomancy, um, you are a small person coming to very powerful cosmic forces, asking for information or guidance about your place in a much broader web. Um, the way corporate culture tends to work is, well, I contract things out. I tell you what I want. You give me that information, and then I, put it into practice. I'm in control all the time.
Hmm. Hmm.
One of the great benefits of geomantic systems is it forces us to reorient ourselves and say, I'm not necessarily in control. I'm asking for advice and guidance about how to position myself. So if I were, say, a CEO and I want to boost productivity, I would need to be prepared for the fact that the geomancer might tell me, well, you don't actually need to be more productive. I'm not giving you advice on productivity. I'm giving you advice about the environmental impact that, your company
Hmm.
is having. Or I'm giving you advice about the difficult working conditions of your employees. I'm giving you advice about other things that you need to solve. You get the message that the cosmos believes that you need, whether it's God or how
Yes.
it's articulated
Yes.
in tradition. That's what you get. You don't get to tell the geomancer or the diviner, this is the information that I want. It almost works the other way around. You're given your marching orders, and of course, it's your decision whether you want to listen to it or not. But it might not give you the answer that you're looking for. And I have witnessed that happen multiple times. But it always works out better if you listen.
Lovely. That was such an interesting chat. Thank you, Dr. Ogunnaike, for this valuable information. And and thank you to our listeners for being here. I hope they've understood a little more about geomancy and Ifa, and what I hope they will approach this with respect and with an open heart and see how they can use the knowledge of the cosmos to live in better order, to live in better order with nature, with the environment, with the universe. So thank you for being here. And I hope to our listeners, you learned something new and that you'll carry this knowledge from our ancient traditions, incorporate a little bit into your everyday lives, and that it'll help you find clarity, peace, and a deeper connection to the world around you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Someone who has a very cluttered attic, for example, like stuff over their heads that's full, they've never even looked at it in 60 years. You do a thorough decluttering, the person's life changes.
I suggest close the door and open the door in a different sector. So she did it. And after she changed the door, the migrant gone. She actually sent me a WhatsApp message saying, "Oh, feng shui works."